Good evening and welcome back to Sleepy History Archive. Tonight we are not following an emperor, a general, or a dramatic turning point in a famous war. We are doing something smaller and perhaps more soothing. We are stepping into ordinary ancient life and paying attention to the little actions people repeated so often that they were almost invisible to themselves. These are the quiet domestic rituals that gave shape to a day. The first bowl of water lifted in the morning, the smoothing of linen, the straightening of sandals at the threshold, the lighting of a lamp at dusk, and the patient folding of fabric before bed. History often preserves loud things. It keeps the memory of conquest, decrees, monuments, processions, and names written in stone. But most people did not spend their time standing in history books. They washed, tied, carried, swept, mended, waited, poured, and prepared. Their lives were held together not by spectacle but by repetition. And repetition, when looked at gently, has its own quiet beauty. So tonight we will walk through the ancient day by way of habit. We will notice the basin before breakfast, the care of hair and skin, the household shrine near a door or courtyard, the trip to a fountain, the steady work of airing cloth, and the delicate importance of a lamp that must last until sleep arrives. We will move slowly, and there is no need to remember every detail. Let the routines arrange themselves around you the way they once arranged ancient rooms. If you are ready, settle in, soften your breathing, and allow the small repeated motions of the past to do what they have always done best. Create order, familiarity, and calm. Before we enter the first room of the day, it may help to imagine the pace of this world as slower than ours, but not empty. Ancient life was not quiet because nothing happened. It was quiet because so many things happened by hand. A door had to be opened by a body. A lamp had to be trimmed by fingers. Water had to be carried with care. Clothing had to be shaken, brushed, aired, and folded. Food had to be lifted from storage, inspected, warmed, softened, or divided. Every comfort had a little motion attached to it. That is why a domestic ritual can tell us so much. It is not a grand historical document, but it is a kind of evidence written in gesture. When the same motion is repeated every morning, it begins to teach the body what the world is like. The person who reaches for the same pitcher learns the coolness of clay. The person who ties the same sandal learns the weakness of one strap. The person who lights the same lamp learns exactly how much oil remains by the weight of it in the hand. History is often described as a sequence of changes, but home is where continuity makes itself felt. Tonight, then, we are not trying to reconstruct one single city or one single household. We are allowing many ancient rooms to overlap gently. A Mediterranean courtyard, a modest earthen floor, a stone threshold, a wooden chest, a shelf of jars, a corner where a lamp waits for dusk. The details may differ from place to place, but the human pattern remains recognizable. People woke. They prepared themselves. They cared for objects because objects made life possible. They crossed the threshold and returned again. They turned daylight into work and lamplight into rest. There is no rush in this kind of history. A basin can take its time. A comb can pass slowly through hair. A loaf can be broken without urgency. A jar can be carried along a familiar street, and the street can be allowed to unfold at walking speed. If you begin to drift as we move, that is perfectly all right. The point is not to hold every image tightly. The point is to let one gentle image lead to the next, until the ancient day feels less like a lesson and more like a room you have entered softly. So we begin where many days began. Not with announcement, but with the small sound of water. The first basin of water. Day in the ancient world often began with water, even when water itself required effort. In many homes, the first act of the morning was not dramatic awakening but a practical reaching toward a basin, a pitcher, or a jar that had been filled the day before. Water was cool from storage, sometimes dusty at the rim of the vessel, sometimes clear and inviting, and always slightly precious. It was lifted carefully. It was poured with intention. A household that began with water began by restoring the body to order. The motion was likely familiar enough to be nearly automatic. A person would bend, pour a little into the basin, wash the face, perhaps the hands and neck, and clear away the heaviness of sleep. Eyes opened more fully under cool water. The skin, which had collected the residue of night, began to feel presentable. If a servant assisted, the ritual could be smoother. If one did the work alone, the pace was slower, more thoughtful, and perhaps more intimate. In a modest house, the basin might be simple pottery or metal. In a wealthier one, the vessel might be finer, but the gesture itself was much the same. Ancient comfort was often built from a limited set of actions repeated well. A great house did not abolish the morning basin. It only refined the objects used for it. The small splash, the wiping with cloth, and the pause after washing belonged to almost everyone. This first contact with water also drew a boundary between sleep and activity. One did not simply rise and begin the day at full speed. The day had to be entered. Water served as a gatekeeper. It said that the night was ending, that the face must meet other faces, that the house was waking, and that the body ought to appear ready to take its place within that larger rhythm. If we linger beside that basin for a little longer, the room around it begins to appear. Perhaps the floor is cool beneath bare feet. Perhaps a shutter is only partly open, allowing a narrow blade of pale morning light to fall across the vessel. A pitcher stands nearby, its handle worn smooth by years of lifting. The water inside may have been drawn the evening before, when the household still had enough light to prepare for morning. In that sense, even this first act of waking was partly a gift from yesterday. The basin also reminds us that cleanliness was never only a physical condition. It was a feeling of readiness. To wash the face was to gather oneself. It was to remove sleep not only from the skin but from the expression. A person might cup the water, blink into it, and breathe a little more deeply as the first coolness spread across the cheeks. The body, which had been private and folded into bedding, began to become public again. Even before anyone stepped outside, the day had begun to ask for composure. The sound of poured water would have been small but definite. In an ancient house where so many materials were natural and textured, even a little sound could have presence. Water striking pottery, cloth being wrung, a vessel set down carefully so it would not chip. A child might hear that sound and know the household was waking. An older person might recognize who was at the basin by the timing and the weight of the step. Rituals are not only seen by those who perform them, they are heard by everyone nearby. Water also taught economy. A modern faucet encourages forgetting, but a stored jar asks for attention. Each pour is a decision. Enough to cleanse, not so much as to waste. Enough to refresh, not enough to require another journey too soon. This quiet discipline would have shaped the whole gesture. The hand did not simply splash carelessly. It measured. It understood that water belonged not only to the present moment but to cooking later, to washing cloth, to cooling a cup, to tending a child, to settling dust from the floor. And then there was the cloth. It might have been rough from repeated use, or softened by years of washing. It gathered the water from the face and hands, leaving the skin cooler and more awake. When hung back in its place, it became part of the room's continuing order. The basin was emptied or set aside. The pitcher returned to its corner. Nothing grand had happened. Yet the day had crossed its first threshold. and the body had been gently invited back into the world. Oil, skin, and the quiet work of presentation. Ancient grooming was not only about appearance. It was about comfort, health, and the practical management of climate. In dry regions or dusty streets, skin benefited from oil and hair did too. A tiny amount rubbed into the hands and spread across the arms or face could soften roughness and keep the body from feeling neglected. Oils also carried scent. Sometimes that scent was faint and plant-like. Sometimes it was clearly perfumed, warm with resin, herbs, or flowers. This process was rarely extravagant in ordinary homes. It was measured. A little oil went a long way. A person did not pour luxury over the body. He or she worked it in carefully, almost sparingly, and then continued on. The quietness of the act is part of what makes it so interesting. It was not a performance. It was maintenance. The ancient day involved dust, heat, smoke, sweat, and fabric rubbing against skin. Oil answered those conditions with a simple, repeatable kindness. There is something soothing about picturing this without hurry. A hand closes around a small flask. The stopper is removed. A few drops shine in the morning light. Fingers warm the oil before spreading it. Hair is smoothed down where sleep has displaced it. Perhaps a parent performs the action for a child. Perhaps an older woman teaches a younger one how much is enough. Knowledge of the body passed quietly through these ordinary routines. The care of appearance also mattered socially. Ancient communities were observant. Neighbors, colleagues, kin, servants, and patrons all read the body for signs of discipline, disorder, wealth, health, and self-respect. To be washed and lightly groomed was to announce readiness. Even a modest person could claim dignity through neatness, and neatness began in these small motions that no inscription thought worth recording. The oil flask, when we imagine it carefully, is almost a small archive of its own. It holds not only oil but fields, presses, storage rooms, trade routes, and the patience of those who prepared it. Even the simplest oil had a history before it touched the skin. In a household, that history became intimate. A drop placed on the palm lost its distance from agriculture and commerce. It became warmth, scent, and touch. A person might apply it without thinking, yet the body would still understand the comfort. Dry elbows, cracked hands, wind-marked cheeks, and hair roughened by dust could all be calmed by a little smoothness. It is easy to underestimate this kind of care because it leaves no monument behind. But the ancient body lived in close contact with weather. Walls could shelter, but they could not remove heat, grit, smoke, or sun. Oil answered a world that was always touching the skin. There may also have been a social tenderness in this practice. Someone preparing for the day could care for another. A mother smoothing a child's hair, a spouse rubbing a little oil into tired hands, an elder receiving help with a stiff shoulder or dry skin. The same substance could serve vanity, health, affection, and habit, all without changing its form. Domestic rituals often work like that. They are practical on the surface, but beneath the practical action lies a whole language of attention. Scent made the ritual even more memorable. A faint plant smell could cling to the body long after the morning had moved on. It might mix with wool, linen, bread, smoke, and street dust until it became almost invisible to the person wearing it. But others might notice. The smell of a familiar household oil could announce belonging as gently as a voice. Ancient identity was not only seen in garments or jewelry. It was also carried in the small atmosphere surrounding a person. After the oil was used, the flask was closed again. That closing matters. It returned the precious material to safekeeping. It also concluded the little ceremony. The hands were rubbed together one last time, perhaps wiped lightly on cloth, perhaps lifted to smooth hair again. The face was not transformed, but it was prepared. The body had been acknowledged. And in a world where the day could be dusty, demanding, and uncertain, that acknowledgement was no small thing. Combs, pins, and ordered hair. Hair has always required patience, and in the ancient world that patience took the form of combs, pins, ties, cloth bands, and practiced hands. Before the street, before the workshop, before the shared table, hair had to be untangled and directed into some acceptable shape. This was not vanity alone. Hair collected dust, trapped heat, and became unruly quickly. A comb passing through it was part comfort, part order, and part social necessity. The comb itself could be a humble object, made of bone or wood, smooth with use and known to the hand that held it. It moved slowly, especially if the hair was long. One did not rush such work without paying for it in pain. The morning room therefore contained a rhythm of pauses. Comb, pause, gather, separate, smooth again. In some homes another person helped, and then the ritual became conversational or companionable. In others it was done in silence, a daily act of self-management. Pins and ties mattered because hair was not only worn, it was organized. A style that held through heat, movement, or labor saved effort later. The practical intelligence in ancient grooming is often underrated. These routines were designed by people who understood time, climate, and the inconvenience of repeated disorder. An efficient arrangement of hair could be the difference between constant annoyance and relative ease. And there is also the matter of identity. Hair carried age, status, custom, region, and sometimes religious or political meaning. The way it was parted, covered, braided, knotted, or adorned signaled belonging. Yet even before symbolism came the simpler truth. Most mornings began with the body being put back into alignment, strand by strand, until a person could step outside without feeling unfinished. If the basin awakened the face and oil comforted the skin, the comb brought patience to the morning. Hair records the night. It keeps the shape of sleep, the pressure of cloth, the restlessness of turning, the dryness of air. To comb it is to persuade the body back into form. The action may be ordinary, but it requires a kind of cooperation between hand and head. Pull too quickly, and the ritual becomes sharp. Move slowly, and disorder gives way strand by strand. The objects used for hair often had a closeness to the body that made them quietly personal. A comb might belong to one person for years. Its teeth could be uneven from use. Its edge could grow polished where the thumb rested. A pin might be known by its slight bend. A band of cloth might carry a faint trace of oil. These things lived in the private geography of the household, kept in a box, on a shelf, or near a sleeping place where they could be found without searching. When another person helped, grooming became a small social scene. Someone sat while someone else stood behind. The seated person surrendered a little control. The helper took on a careful responsibility. Conversation might be soft, practical, or entirely absent. A child could learn stillness this way. An older person could receive care without making a formal request. A household could express affection through the humble act of making someone presentable. Ordered hair also carried time within it. A style had to last through labor, heat, errands, or prayer. Pins were not decorative alone. They were architecture. Braids, knots, wraps, and coverings were practical designs for moving through the world with less annoyance. The ancient mourning, therefore, included little acts of engineering performed at the scale of the body. The goal was not perfection in the modern sense. It was stability, and once the hair was arranged, the person often felt more complete. The body no longer belonged entirely to the softness of the bed or mat. It had been prepared for eyes, for work, for neighbors, for the street. The comb returned to its place. Loose strands might be swept away or ignored until later. A pin was pressed a final time. A head lifted. The day, which had begun with cool water, now had a shape that could hold. Threshold customs and the small shrine. Many ancient households marked the boundary between inside and outside with more than a door. A threshold was a place of attention. It could receive a glance, a pause, a careful step, a protective gesture, or a small offering. Near it one might find a household shrine, a niche, a little lamp, flowers, ash, a figurine, or some reminder that the home was not merely shelter but a moral and sacred space. The scale of such ritual varied widely, of course. Some households had elaborate customs, others very small ones, and many probably moved between the two depending on means, season, and mood. But the pattern itself is telling. Ancient people often treated ordinary spaces as layered with significance. A threshold was practical, certainly, but also symbolic. It was where safety ended and uncertainty began. It was where family life met public life. This means that morning departure and evening return could both acquire a faint ceremonial quality. One checked the doorway. One acknowledged the shrine. One adjusted a garment or set something down. Children learned the expected behavior through repetition long before they could explain it. The point was not always solemn religion. Sometimes it was simply habit, but habit shaped feeling, and feeling made the home coherent. Even now we can understand the comfort of repeated gestures near a door. Checking keys, touching a frame, looking back once into a room. The ancient world had its own versions of this. The home was steadied by little acts of acknowledgement. Nothing had to be grand. A pinch of grain, a wiped surface, a relit lamp, or a respectful pause could make a dwelling feel watched over, remembered, and properly entered. A threshold is easy to overlook because it is crossed so often. Yet that is precisely why it matters. The repeated crossing gives it weight. The foot knows where the floor changes. The hand knows where the doorframe is smooth. The eye knows the little marks near the entrance. Smoke darkening from a lamp, dust gathered in a corner, perhaps a niche or shelf where a small sacred object rests. The threshold is not simply an edge of architecture. It is the place where habit becomes aware of transition. The small shrine, when present, brought invisible concerns into visible form. A household could not control all that waited beyond the door. Weather, illness, strangers, debt, argument, accident, hunger, chance. But it could pause. It could offer a little grain, a flower, a touch, a word, or the relighting of a lamp. These gestures did not need to solve the uncertainty of the world in order to soothe it. They gave uncertainty a place to be acknowledged. Children may have learned these customs before they understood them. They saw adults pause and copied the pause. They watched a hand move toward a niche and learned that this corner deserved care. In this way, ritual passed from one generation to another not mostly through explanation, but through choreography. The body learned first. Meaning arrived later if it arrived at all. The return home could be just as important as the departure. Dust crossed the threshold with the feet. News crossed it with the mouth. Weariness crossed it in the shoulders. To come back inside was to become part of the household again, and sometimes the first moments of return decided the feeling of the evening. A glance at the shrine, a sandal removed, a bundle set down, a door drawn inward. These small acts soften the passage from public strain to private belonging. There is a deep comfort in the thought that ancient homes were guarded not only by walls, but by repeated care. a swept threshold, a remembered offering, a lamp kept from going out, a respectful step over the sill. Each one told the household that the boundary still held. Outside remained outside. Inside remained inside. And the people who lived there could pass between the two with a little more confidence. Bread, salt, and the order of morning food. Breakfast in the ancient world was often simple, and that simplicity is part of its charm. Bread, olives, fruit, cheese, diluted wine, porridge, or leftovers from the day before might provide the first food of morning. What matters for us tonight is not the menu alone but the ritual form around it. Bread was cut or torn. Salt was taken sparingly. Cups were filled. People ate not in abstraction but through repeated gestures that gave the meal its rhythm. The first meal of the day rarely announced itself with elaborate ceremony, yet it still belonged to the domestic order. Tables, stools, benches, trays, and storage jars all played their part. Someone had to uncover the bread, fetch the cup, pour the liquid, and perhaps brush away crumbs afterward. Even when food was modest, the coordination around it linked people together. One person waited while another cut. Another reached for the jug. Another cleared the cloth. These are the tiny acts by which households remember themselves. Salt deserves its own small mention because it was so useful and so suggestive. A little salt preserved, flavored, and sharpened. It also represented value. To take a bit of it at table was to participate in a chain of work stretching far beyond the house. Ancient meals often hid entire systems of labor inside simple objects. Bread carried grain, grinding, kneading, heat, and storage. Oil carried pressing and transport. Salt carried trade. Morning food, then, did more than quiet hunger. It located the eater inside a network of routines. The day could not really begin until nourishment had been folded into the body. In a quiet ancient room, with light entering from a courtyard or doorway, the breaking of bread was less a dramatic scene than an act of daily reassurance. The house had supplies, the body had fuel, and order had once again been restored. Bread at morning has a simplicity that makes it almost timeless. It may be fresh, but just as often it may be yesterday's bread, firmer now, requiring a little dipping or breaking with more pressure. The hand learns the loaf. It knows whether the crust will crack cleanly or tear unevenly. A small meal begins through these tactile decisions. Before taste, there is texture. Before fullness, there is the quiet work of dividing. In an ancient household, food rarely appeared without visible history. A jar had to be opened. A cloth had to be unfolded. Crumbs from the last meal might still be present, reminding everyone that nourishment is continuous rather than isolated. A cup might be rinsed quickly with a little water. A knife, if used, might be wiped on cloth. The table did not become orderly by magic. It became orderly because someone made it so, often before anyone praised the effort. Salt sharpened the plainness of food, but it also reminded the household of restraint. Pinch was enough. Too much would waste what had value. This measured use of small precious things appears again and again in domestic life. Oil, salt, lamp fuel, clean water, good cloth, each had to be used with care. Ancient comfort depended not on abundance alone, but on wise handling. The first meal also arranged relationships. Even in silence, people communicated around food. Peace was passed. A child was given a portion. An elder might receive first attention. Someone noticed whether supplies were low. Someone remembered that more grain would need to be bought or ground. These are practical matters, but they are also emotional ones. To feed a household is to ask, again and again, what everyone will need before the day is done. When the meal ended, the ritual did not simply stop. Leftovers were covered. Crumbs were gathered. Cups were returned. A cloth was shaken outdoors or folded for later. The body had received its first strength, and the room had been restored enough to continue. Morning food, in this way, created a gentle agreement between person and house. The house would provide, and the person would help maintain the order that made provision possible. Sandals, streets, and the step into public life. After washing, grooming, and eating, the body had to cross the line between home and street. Footwear, however simple, became important here. Sandals, slippers, or other practical coverings carried the body into dust, stone, market traffic, workshop floors, and courtyards. To put them on was to accept the day's contact with the outside world. There is a humble dignity in the act of arranging footwear. A sandal strap is checked. The sole is tapped free of grit. Feet that have just been washed and dried are enclosed again, now ready for pavement or packed earth. Ancient streets were not neutral surfaces. They were uneven, warm, muddy, noisy, and full of shared life. Good footwear did not erase discomfort, but it made movement possible. Movement, in turn, was part of social belonging. The first steps outside often came with a sensory change. Inside there had been fabric, pottery, a shaded wall, or a familiar household smell. Outside there was brighter light, sound from passing voices, perhaps animals, wheels, cellars, smoke, and the layered smell of a living street. Ancient routines were built to manage this transition. One did not simply explode outward into noise. One prepared for it. And for many people the walk itself was ritualized. The same route to the fountain, workshop, shrine, bakery, school, or market repeated day after day. Repetition turned geography into memory. The street was learned by the foot as much as by the eye. A person knew where stones sat higher, where shadow lasted longer, where dogs tended to sleep, where one neighbor greeted and another merely nodded. In this way, the outside world became an extension of routine rather than its interruption. The putting on of sandals deserves more attention than it usually receives. It is one of those actions that stands between intention and movement. Before the sandal is tied, the journey is only planned. After it is tied, the body is committed to the street. A strap drawn through a buckle or loop, a sole pressed against the ground, a knot tightened with familiar force. These are the final adjustments before private life becomes public motion. Ancient footwear also reminds us that the street was physical in a way modern surfaces often hide. Stones were irregular. Dust could be fine enough to cling to oiled skin. Mud could gather after rain. Animal traces, market refuse, spilled water, ash, and straw could all become part of the day's path. A sandal did not separate the person from the world completely. It only negotiated the contact. The foot still felt temperature, unevenness, and fatigue. Stepping outside changed the scale of sound. A courtyard might offer a controlled echo, but the street opened into layered noise. A cartwheel, a closing shutter, a vendor calling, water being poured, a neighbor coughing, a child running ahead. The first few steps allowed the senses to adjust. The body moved from the known acoustics of home into the shared sound of the town. Routes mattered because repetition made them almost intimate. A person might choose the side of the street where shade lasted longer, avoid a place where the stones were slick, pass a doorway where someone friendly might appear, or take a longer way to avoid morning crowding. These small choices formed a personal map invisible to strangers. Ancient geography was not only planned by builders, it was refined daily by feet. And when the traveler returned, the sandals brought the street back with them. Dust at the threshold, grit caught in a strap, dampness from a fountain path, a little wear on the sole, Each marked the body's passage through public life. To remove or set aside footwear in the evening was to conclude that contact. The street had been crossed, endured, and learned again. Fountains and the shared rhythm of water. If the household basin was the intimate side of water, the public fountain was its communal side. Here the ancient day widened. Water had to be fetched, and in many towns or neighborhoods that meant a recurring journey with jars, buckets, or amphorae. Fountains were practical infrastructure, but they were also social theaters of a quiet sort. People met there, waited there, exchanged brief remarks, balanced heavy vessels, and carried home what the day required. The rhythm of the fountain was measured by weight and care. Empty containers were easy to manage. Full ones changed the posture of the body. Arms adjusted. Shoulders compensated. The path home had to be taken more slowly. This simple fact shaped daily time. Water did not arrive invisibly from a wall. It had to be incorporated into the body's labor. The amount available in a house depended partly on how often people made that trip and how much effort they could spare. The sounds of such places must have been distinctive. Running water, pottery touching stone, sandals scraping, brief conversation, perhaps laughter, perhaps complaint. Yet none of this needed to be dramatic. The fountain represented steady necessity. Every filled jar carried future rituals inside it. Washing, cooking, cleaning, bathing, mixing wine, settling dust, and preparing for bed. Water linked the entire day together. In that sense, the fountain was one of the great invisible centers of ancient calm. Not because it was always peaceful, but because its regularity anchored life. People knew they would come here. They knew how the vessel felt on the return walk. They knew the patience required by cues, by spills, by heat, by repetition. The day acquired shape from such predictable labor, and the home was made possible by it. The journey to water had a tempo unlike many other errands, because its difficulty changed halfway through. A person left with an empty vessel and returned with a full one. The outward walk might be brisk, almost casual. The return required balance, attention, and controlled breathing. If the jar rested on the hip, the body leaned. If it was carried at the shoulder, the neck and back became part of the work. If two vessels were used, both arms entered a careful symmetry. At the fountain, patience became public. People waited not in isolation but together, each aware that everyone else had similar needs. A queue at water is never merely a queue. It is a shared acknowledgement of dependence. The wealthy, the modest, the young, the old, servants, relatives, neighbors, strangers passing through. All could be brought near one another by the same source. Water made the social world briefly honest. The vessels themselves created a kind of music. Clay knocked softly against stone. A rope creaked. Water struck the inside of an empty jar with a hollow sound that deepened as it filled. Someone shifted weight from one foot to another. Someone warned a child not to spill. Someone laughed at a familiar complaint. None of these sounds needed to be memorable on their own, yet together they gave the fountain its daily voice. Returning home with water also changed the meaning of the household. A full jar was not just an object. It was future comfort stored in a corner. It meant hands could be washed, food could be prepared, dust could be settled, a cloth could be rinsed, a lamp area could be cleaned, a tired person could drink. The labor of carrying water disappeared into all the later acts it made possible. Perhaps this is why water scenes feel so restful when imagined slowly. They combine movement and necessity with continuity. The path to the fountain may have been hot, tiring, and ordinary, but it linked the house to the city and the body to the day. Every jar that arrived home quietly extended the life of the room. Baths as routine, not luxury. Modern imagination often divides bathing into two extremes: lavish spa-like pleasure or minimal emergency washing. Ancient bathing could include pleasure, certainly, but it was also an ordinary routine with strong social and practical dimensions. In some places and periods, people used bathhouses frequently enough that the bath was not a rare indulgence but a familiar part of urban life. Elsewhere, washing remained more private and modest. In either case, the principle was similar. The body needed regular care, and water plus heat offered restoration. To think of bathing only as luxury is to miss its usefulness. Dust clung to skin. Streets left traces. Workshops marked hands. Smoke settled into hair and cloth. Warm water, scraping tools, oil, and cloth could reverse some of that accumulation. The bath returned the body to itself. It also marked time. One did not leave the day entirely unchanged. One shed part of it. Even in a public bath setting, much of the routine was methodical rather than extravagant. Clothing was arranged, objects set aside. The body entered and left different temperatures. Sweat loosened grime, oil was applied, skin was scraped, and conversation drifted through the process. There is a domestic quality even here. A bath was not an escape from reality so much as a structured repair of it. For a sleep-oriented history like ours, the soothing thing is the order. Ancient people knew the calm of emerging cleaner than they had been an hour earlier. They knew the softened limbs, the loosened shoulders, the feeling of hair and skin no longer carrying the full burden of the day. Bathing was one of the great repeated mercies of ordinary life. A bath, whether public or private, was also a lesson in sequence. It was not one action but a chain of small transitions. Clothing was loosened or set aside. The body entered warmth gradually. Skin softened. Oil was spread. Sweat loosened what the day had left behind. A scraping tool, cloth, or hand removed what water alone could not. Then came drying, dressing, and the altered feeling of returning to ordinary air. Public bathing, when available, gave this sequence a social dimension. Voices echoed differently in heated rooms. Steam blurred outlines. People met outside their usual domestic roles and yet remained within another kind of order, governed by custom, timing, modesty, status, and habit. The bathhouse was not only a place of cleaning. It was a place where the day loosened its grip. But even a modest washing at home could hold some of the same meaning. A bowl of warmer water, a cloth, a corner of privacy, a little oil afterward. These were enough to make the body feel restored. Ancient life did not require luxury to experience relief. Relief could be extremely simple. A clean neck after heat, washed feet after dust, hands freed from the smell of work. These small restorations could change the whole evening. The timing of bathing mattered too. Done before a meal, it prepared the body to sit comfortably. Done after labor, it separated work from rest. Done before sleep, it made the bed or mat feel more welcoming. Rituals often gain their power not from their materials, but from their placement in time. Washing says, in effect, that one part of the day has ended and another may begin. And after bathing, there was often a softness in movement. Limbs felt a little heavier, but pleasantly so. Skin met fabric differently. Hair dried slowly. The world seemed less abrasive. This is the quiet mercy the original routine points toward. The body, which had been used all day as an instrument of labor and presence, was returned to itself with care. Linen, sunlight, and the work of drying. Fabric governed comfort in ways ancient people understood deeply. Linen and wool were not passive materials stored in chests. They demanded care. Cloth had to be aired, shaken, folded, mended, washed, dried, and protected from dampness or vermin. Much of ancient domestic order therefore involved not just people but textiles moving continually between body, room, sun, and storage. There is something restful in thinking of linen spread out to catch air and light. A garment worn yesterday might now be hanging over a line, a rail, or a courtyard edge. Sunlight became a household tool. Breezes did part of the work. The fabric lost odor, moisture, and the faint heaviness of enclosed storage. When retrieved, it felt cooler, cleaner, and more ready to serve again. This care required judgment. Too much sun could fade. Too little air left fabric stale. Dust had to be avoided. Sudden weather could ruin patient labor. Ancient households therefore watched cloth the way later households watched machines. Constantly, attentively, and with practical intelligence. Linen especially rewarded discipline because it lay close to the skin. Clean linen could transform the feel of a whole day or night. Folding completed the ritual. A smooth garment placed properly in a chest or on a shelf represented future comfort stored in advance. Disorder, by contrast, meant wasted time later. The work of drying and folding was therefore not secondary domestic background. It was central to how ancient homes maintained calm. The body slept and woke inside a world built from well-managed cloth. Textiles make a household visible in motion. A garment hanging in a courtyard, a cloth spread over a rail, a sheet shaken in morning air, a shawl folded and placed inside a chest. Each one shows domestic time at work. Ancient cloth did not simply wait to be worn. It moved through cycles of use, fatigue, cleansing, drying, repair, and rest. Sunlight was one of the great household assistants. It warmed, brightened, and freshened, but it also demanded judgment. A careful person knew when to place fabric fully in the sun and when to keep it partly shaded. Fine cloth might need gentler treatment. Everyday cloth could endure more. Weather, dust, insects, and smoke all had to be considered. To care for linen well was to read the environment. The act of shaking cloth has a satisfying clarity. It releases dust, straightens folds, and briefly fills the air with the shape of the fabric. For a moment, the garment becomes larger than itself, catching light before settling back into the hands. Such motions are common enough to disappear from memory, yet they are among the oldest movements of housekeeping. People have been shaking, airing, and folding cloth for as long as cloth has touched the human body. Storage was another kind of ritual. A chest or shelf could either protect order or conceal disorder. To place folded fabric properly was to prepare for an unseen future moment when that cloth would be needed quickly. A good fold saved time later. It also showed respect for labor already spent. The spinning, weaving, washing, drying, and mending that made the textile valuable. At night, clean or well-aired cloth could transform rest. The difference between stale fabric and fresh fabric is felt immediately by the body. Ancient households understood this without needing to name it. The care of linen was therefore not a background chore. It was part of the architecture of comfort. A peaceful room is often made from fabrics that have been handled kindly. Perfume, smoke, and the quiet art of smell. Ancient households were deeply sensory places, and smell carried enormous weight. Smoke from hearths, oil lamps, bodies, cooked food, damp walls, fresh bread, animals, herbs, resin, and perfume all met one another in the same domestic atmosphere. Good order, then, was not only visual, it was aromatic. To manage smell was to manage mood, status, comfort, and memory. Perfume in ordinary life was not always lavish. Often it appeared as a trace rather than a cloud. A scented oil on the wrist, dried herbs among textiles, resin in a burner, or flowers placed briefly in a room. Such measures did not erase the realities of smoke or labor, but they softened them. Ancient people understood that pleasant scent could refine an enclosed space and change the feeling of a body freshly washed or a garment newly folded. At the same time, smoke was unavoidable. Hearths cooked food. Lamps lit rooms. Braziers warmed air. Incense marked sacred moments. Even a well-run household could not become odorless. Instead, it learned balance. Windows or courtyards vented what they could. Fragrant materials countered what remained. The result was not modern sterility, but a layered atmosphere. Fire, oil, cloth, and plant all living together. Smell also had the power of repetition. A particular herb, resin, or lamp oil could become the signature of a household or even a season. To return home and catch that familiar trace was to feel oriented. One knew where one was. Ancient domestic life relied on such subtle confirmations. Comfort was often a matter of recognition, and smell was among the quickest forms of recognition the body possessed. Smell is one of the most powerful ways a home becomes itself. Ancient rooms would have had layered scents that changed with the hour. Damp coolness in the morning, bread or porridge as food warmed, dust and bodies at midday, herbs or oil in storage, smoke gathering toward evening, and the faint mineral smell of water poured over stone or clay. A household was not a blank space. It was an atmosphere continually being made. Pleasant scent did not need to be strong to matter. A little herb tucked among textiles could make opening a chest feel calmer. A trace of resin in a sacred corner could mark a pause as special. Flowers brought indoors might fade quickly, but while they lasted they changed the room. Scent was temporary, and perhaps that is part of its gentleness. It did not build a monument. It simply improved an hour. Smoke, by contrast, was both useful and persistent. It cooked, warmed, sanctified, and illuminated, while also clinging to rafters, hair, and cloth. The ancient household lived in negotiation with smoke. Openings had to be managed. Fires had to be watched. Lamps had to be trimmed so they did not foul the air more than necessary. The skill was not to eliminate smoke completely, but to keep it within tolerable bounds. There is a kind of domestic wisdom in accepting a layered atmosphere rather than demanding purity. The smell of oil, ash, bread, wool, damp pottery, herbs, and skin could all belong together. Each signaled something about the house's life. Food had been cooked. A lamp had been lit. Cloth had been stored. Water had been carried. People had returned. A perfectly empty smell would have meant a different kind of emptiness. Before sleep, scent could be especially affecting. The lamp's oil, the cooling hearth, the cloth near the body, the faint trace of whatever had been prepared for supper. All of it gathered into the final impression of the room. The mind may not list these scents, but the body receives them. It knows through smell that it is somewhere familiar enough to rest. The market ritual of measuring and choosing. Not every daily ritual happened indoors. Many depended on the market, where routines of exchange gave public order to private needs. To buy grain, oil, fish, vegetables, cloth, or small household goods was not merely to obtain supplies. It was to participate in a repeated social choreography of weighing, comparing, asking, accepting, and carrying away. Markets trained attention. The eye learned freshness. The hand learned weight. The ear learned prices and the tones of honest or exaggerated persuasion. For households running on limited means, choosing well mattered. A bad purchase could disturb several future meals or repairs. Thus market habits became highly developed. One approached certain sellers with trust, others with caution. One knew at what hour goods looked best. One knew when to linger and when to buy quickly. There is a soothing side to this once we remove the noise of modern commerce. Ancient markets were busy, yes, but they were also places of pattern. The same goods appeared in familiar arrangements. The same calls returned. The same paths through the stalls repeated over weeks and years. Familiarity reduced anxiety. A person who knew the market well moved through it with something like domestic confidence. Back at home, the purchased items re-entered ritual time. Oil joined the shelf. Bread joined the cloth. Herbs joined the jar. Fish or grain entered the evening meal. Nothing stayed abstract for long. Exchange turned quickly back into domestic use, and that loop between market and household was one of the great engines of ordinary calm. The market may seem too lively for a sleepy history, but its rituals can be observed gently. Beneath the noise there was pattern. Goods arrived in familiar containers. Sellers arranged their spaces with practiced speed. Buyers moved through routes they had learned over time. A hand tested fruit, grain, cloth, or pottery. An eye searched for freshness, damage, weight, color, and honesty. The market trained people to notice. Measuring was especially important because trust had to become visible. A scale, a scoop, a basket, or a counted number turned exchange into a shared performance. Both sides watched. The buyer wanted fairness. The seller wanted livelihood. The little pause before agreement, the weighing of a quantity, the nod, the objection, the acceptance, these motions gave economic life its daily rhythm. For the household, a market choice carried consequences beyond the moment. Poor grain might make disappointing bread. Bad oil could affect cooking, lamps, or skin. Weak cloth might fail after too few uses. A cracked pot might not survive the week. This meant that buying was not only spending. It was protecting future calm. The careful shopper was defending the household against inconvenience that had not yet happened. The market also refreshed the news of the community. People learned who had arrived, what was scarce, which road was difficult, whose family had visitors, whether prices were rising, whether weather had harmed a crop. Much of this information moved casually in fragments while hands measured and eyes compared. Domestic life was never sealed completely inside the home. It was fed by the public world, both materially and verbally. When the shopper returned, the market's liveliness was translated back into order. Goods were sorted. A bundle was unwrapped. A jar was filled. A purchase was judged again under household light. The outside world became supper, cloth, oil, fuel, or storage. This transformation is one of the quiet miracles of daily life. The crowded market disappears into the calm of a shelf. Writing tablets and the memory of the house. Ancient homes did not all contain extensive writing, but wherever writing entered domestic life, it performed a quiet stabilizing role. Notes, accounts, labels, copied verses, small letters, shopping reminders, school exercises, and legal memoranda all helped a household remember what a human mind might otherwise lose. Wax tablets, scraps of papyrus, potsherds, and inked surfaces became tools for keeping order across time. There is a gentle beauty in the thought of a table with writing tools set out. Stylus, ink, lamp, folded scrap, perhaps a weight to keep paper from moving in a draft. Such a place represented more than literacy. It represented the desire to make fleeting matters remain. How much grain came in? What was owed? Which errand must not be forgotten? Memory is tiring when held only in the head. Writing lightened that burden. For children, practice writing itself could become ritual. The repeated shaping of letters, the correction of forms, the smoothing of the surface, the careful copying of a phrase, these actions trained patience. They also bound the body into knowledge. One learned not just by seeing but by tracing. In a sleepier mood, We can think of writing as one more ancient act of arrangement. Like folding cloth or refilling oil, it prevented future disorder. It created a bridge from one hour to another. The house that kept even a few written reminders was extending itself through time, making tomorrow slightly easier than it would otherwise be. Writing, where it was available, gave the household a second memory. Human memory is warm and flexible, but it is also fragile. Promise can blur. A number can be forgotten. A debt can be disputed. A shopping need can vanish from the mind until the moment it is too late. A written mark fixed a little piece of the future in place. The tools themselves were modestly beautiful. A wax tablet could be smoothed and reused, holding the temporary concerns of a day. A stylus could press thought into surface with a faint resistance felt by the hand. Ink required more preparation and care. Papyrus, parchment, or a potsherd could carry words beyond the room. Each material shaped the kind of memory it held: quick, formal, private, durable, or disposable. Domestic writing did not need to be literary to matter. A list of supplies, a record of payment, a copied line for practice, a small letter sent to a relative, a label tied to a container. These are humble texts, but they show a house trying to remain organized across time. The ancient home did not only store food, cloth, and tools. It stored obligations. For a child learning letters, repetition could be as bodily as sweeping or grinding grain. The hand formed a sign again and again. Mistakes were corrected. A teacher, parent, or older sibling might guide the motion. The surface was cleared. The letter was attempted once more. Knowledge entered through patience. There is something sleepily rhythmic in that. Mark, pause, correct, repeat. At the end of the day, a tablet or note might remain near a lamp, waiting for morning attention. It held something the mind had chosen not to carry alone through sleep. That is a gentle thought. Writing allowed a person to rest without surrendering responsibility. The house remembered on their behalf. Midday shade and the pause of the body. Not all ritual is motion. Some of it is pause. In warm climates especially, midday imposed its own logic. The body slowed. Shade acquired value. Food became simpler. Work, where possible, adjusted. Ancient daily life was not uniform from dawn to dusk. It bent around heat, fatigue, and the physical truth that bodies are not machines. A bench in shadow, a courtyard wall, a colonnade, a cool room with thick masonry, a folded cloth under the head. These could all become part of midday ritual. Pause did not mean luxury. It meant prudence. The day was long, and to continue well required intervals of stillness. Conversation quieted. Movements softened. Even animals often seem to understand this rhythm and become less urgent for a while. There is something deeply human in that surrender to the middle of the day. Ancient people could be industrious without pretending to be relentless. Rest was not always an exception to life. Sometimes it was built into the fabric of responsible living. A short recline, a cooling drink, or a moment of closed eyes under shade could restore proportion. When we imagine the ancient world, we often fill it with constant labor. But labor itself depends on the wise use of stillness. The day was navigated through alternating measures of effort and release. Midday pause belongs to the domestic rituals of history because it reminds us that endurance also requires gentleness. Midday has its own authority. Morning begins with intention, evening with return, but midday often asks for negotiation. Heat gathers, light hardens, shadows shrink or move to places already known by habit. Ancient people who lived with strong sun learned the value of timing. Some tasks belonged to early hours, others to later ones. The middle of the day could not always be conquered. it had to be accommodated. Shade therefore became almost a form of furniture. A wall, a tree, a colonnade, a hanging cloth, an awning, or a deep doorway could create a place where the body recovered proportion. To sit there was not necessarily idleness. It was sensible alignment with the world. The same hands that worked hard at dawn might rest at noon so they could work again when the air softened. Food at midday might be lighter or simpler, but even a small pause around a cup, fruit, bread, or leftovers could reset the day. The body received enough to continue, not always enough to celebrate. Conversation might become slower. The voice naturally lowers when heat presses down. Even thought can become quieter, moving less like argument and more like drifting observation. In a household, midday pause also created a rare overlap of stillness. Objects seemed to wait. Jars stood in their corners. Cloth hung without being handled. Tools lay where they had been set down. Dust became visible in strong light. A child might sleep. An elder might close their eyes. A dog might lie flat where the floor held coolness. For a little while, the house breathed rather than labored. This pause is important because it corrects the idea that ancient life was only hardship and motion. It was hardship, certainly, for many. It was labor, undoubtedly. But it also contained intelligent rests, small permissions, and bodily wisdom. The ancient day endured because it was divided into rhythms a human being could survive. Sweeping floors and settling dust. Between the brightness of midday and the inward turn of evening, there was often the humble work of sweeping. Dust was one of the constant companions of ancient life. It entered on sandals, rose from streets, settled from walls, drifted from courtyards, and gathered beneath stools, beds, storage jars, and thresholds. A clean room did not remain clean by itself. It had to be returned to order again and again by the slow persuasion of a broom. The broom might have been a bundle of twigs, reeds, fibers, or stiff grasses tied together for use. Its sound would have been soft and scratchy, a dry whisper across stone, packed earth, tile, or wooden boards. The sweeping hand learned the room intimately. It knew where dust gathered first, where crumbs hid, where ash traveled from the hearth, where children dropped bits of food, and where the doorway allowed the outside world to creep in. Sweeping was not only cleaning, it was also seeing. To sweep a room carefully was to inspect it without ceremony. A missing pin could be found. A cracked shard could be noticed. A spilled grain could be rescued before insects discovered it. A stain or damp patch might reveal a problem. Domestic order depended on this daily attention, the kind that does not announce itself as intelligence but quietly prevents trouble. The threshold received special care because it was the mouth of the house. Dust at the entrance seemed to speak of neglect, while a swept entry suggested vigilance. A person might sweep outward, sending grit back toward the street, or gather it carefully for disposal. The gesture had a satisfying finality. The inside world was separated again from what had blown or been carried in. After sweeping, the floor changed the atmosphere of the room. It did not become luxurious, but it became calmer. Feet moved over it differently. Objects seemed more placed. Light fell without catching as much loose dust. The room had been reset, and as with so many domestic rituals, the work would not last forever. Dust would return. That is exactly why the ritual mattered. It was not victory over disorder once and for all. It was a daily agreement to keep disorder from taking over. The hearth and the patient fire. If the lamp belonged especially to evening, the hearth belonged to many parts of the day. It might wake early for warmth or cooking, settle into embers after a meal, and return again when food needed softening. Fire in the household was never merely an element. It was a responsibility. It had to be fed, watched, contained, and respected. A hearth could be simple, perhaps a defined place for coals, a brazier, or an area where cooking heat was managed with stones, clay, or metal. Around it gathered some of the most basic domestic actions: warming water, baking, simmering, roasting, drying, and sometimes heating the body during colder hours. The smell of the hearth entered clothing and hair. Its ash became part of sweeping. Its heat shaped the timing of food and the arrangement of people nearby. Starting or preserving fire required skill. Embers might be guarded carefully so the household would not have to begin again from nothing. Fuel had to be chosen and used wisely. Too much flame could waste resources or endanger the room. Too little could leave food unfinished. A cook learned by watching, adjusting, waiting, and listening. The fire gave signs: a crackle, a dull glow, a sudden flare, a thinning warmth. The household answered those signs with practiced hands. Cooking by patient fire changed the emotional pace of food. Some things could not be rushed. Grain softened in its own time. Pot thickened slowly. Bread needed heat that was strong enough but not destructive. The person tending the hearth learned to remain nearby without constant intervention. There is a deep quiet in that kind of waiting, a waiting that is not empty but attentive. At the end of a cooking period, the hearth still needed care. Ash might be moved. Embers might be covered or gathered. A vessel might be pulled away to cool. The fire that had served the room could not simply be forgotten. It required a final act of respect. In this way, the hearth was both servant and guest, useful, necessary, and never entirely safe unless treated with thought. Jars, shelves, and the grammar of storage. A household is partly made by what it keeps and how it keeps it. Ancient storage was a language of jars, baskets, chests, sacks, shelves, hooks, niches, and corners. Every object needed a place, because a misplaced object could cost time, food, patience, or safety. The jar for oil, the container for grain, the basket for cloth, the hook for a tool, the shelf for a lamp, each position formed part of the house's memory. Storage vessels had personalities. A large jar was not moved casually. A small bottle could disappear if placed carelessly. A basket might breathe enough for certain goods but not protect against damp. A chest could guard textiles, documents, or valuables, but only if it was kept dry and orderly. People learned these qualities through use. Domestic knowledge was often object knowledge. Which lid fit, which jar sealed well, which shelf stayed cool, which corner caught smoke. Opening a storage container was also a ritual. The hand lifted a lid, untied a cloth, moved a stone weight, or reached into shadow. Inside waited the household's future. Flour, dried fruit, beans, oil, herbs, cloth, tools, coins, documents, or little items saved because they might someday matter. To store something was to believe in later need. To retrieve it was to prove that earlier care had been worthwhile. Order in storage reduced anxiety. A person who knew where things were could move through the day with less hesitation. In dim light, during illness, in bad weather, or when a visitor arrived unexpectedly, that order mattered. The calm of a house is often born long before the moment when calm is needed. It is born when someone puts a useful object back in its place. At intervals, shelves and containers had to be checked. Grain could spoil. Oil could run low. Herbs could lose strength. Cloth could attract pests. A hidden crack could appear in a vessel. The ancient household therefore practiced a quiet form of inventory, not always written down, but held in the eyes and hands of those who cared for the space. Storage was not stillness. It was preparation resting in visible form. Needles, thread, and small repairs. Mending is one of the most intimate domestic rituals because it begins with damage and ends with continued use. A tear in cloth, a loosened strap, a fraying edge, a weak seam, or a broken tie did not automatically mean replacement. Replacement could be costly, slow, or impossible. Repair was the ordinary art of extending life. A needle, thread, awl, patch, or spare strip of fabric might be kept among household tools with great care. These objects were small, but their usefulness was large. A lost needle could interrupt several necessary tasks. A good thread could make an old garment serviceable again. A patch chosen well could strengthen a weak place without drawing too much attention. The repairer needed patience, light, and steady fingers. Mending often happened in the quieter parts of the day, when large work was finished or paused. It suited lamplight, shade, conversation, or silence. The rhythm of stitching is naturally calming. Pass through, pull, tighten, adjust, pass through again. Each stitch makes the next possible. Progress is visible but gradual. A torn thing slowly returns to usefulness under the hand. There is also a moral beauty in repair. It resists waste. It honors the labor already present in an object. A garment may have taken many hands to create before it ever reached the household. Fiber gathered, spun, woven, cut, shaped, worn, washed, dried. To mend it is to acknowledge that history and say that the object still belongs to the living day. Children watching such work could learn more than technique. They learned that things are cared for after they are damaged. They learned that imperfection does not always require abandonment. They learned that patience can be practical. Ancient homes were full of these lessons, spoken softly through tools. A repaired seam may not impress a historian of empires, but it can reveal an entire philosophy of living. Children and the household rhythm. In many ancient homes, children learned daily ritual by being near it. They watched before they helped. They saw water poured, bread broken, hair combed, lamps trimmed, thresholds respected, cloth folded, and floors swept. Long before they could describe domestic order, they absorbed its timing. Morning had one texture, midday another, evening another. The household was their first clock. A child might be given a small task. Hold a cup, carry a light object, fetch a cloth, keep away from the lamp, sit still while hair was arranged, bring sandals closer to the door, or shake crumbs from a surface. These tasks may have seemed minor, but they introduced responsibility in manageable form. A child learns belonging by being trusted with something small enough to succeed at. Mistakes were part of the rhythm too. Water spilled. A jar was placed badly. A knot came loose. A child forgot an instruction or handled something too roughly. The household corrected and continued. Rituals are forgiving because they return. Tomorrow offers another chance to carry the vessel more carefully, fold the garment more neatly, or remember not to cross the threshold with muddy feet. Children also made the house less orderly, of course. They scattered, interrupted, asked, cried, played, and transformed useful spaces into imaginative ones. Yet this too belonged to domestic life. The goal of household ritual was not frozen perfection. It was the repeated restoration of livable order after the natural disturbances of being human. As children grew, the motions they had watched became their own. The hand that once reached clumsily for a cup later poured water for someone else. The child who once sat impatiently for combing later smoothed another child's hair. In this way, ancient domestic rituals crossed generations not as written laws, but as remembered movements. The household taught by repetition and the body remembered. Courtyards, animals, and evening tidying. Where homes included courtyards, yards, or shared outer spaces, evening often brought a final round of tidying. The day had left things out of place. A stool might need moving. A vessel might need covering. Cloth might need bringing in before damp settled. Tools might need returning to a wall or shelf. A small animal might need checking, feeding, or guiding into a safer place for the night. Animals, where present, added another layer of rhythm. Birds, goats, dogs, donkeys, cats, or other familiar creatures shaped the household's sound and movement. They required feeding, watching, cleaning, or simply tolerance. They also noticed the day's transitions. Animals often become quiet or restless at predictable hours, and humans learn to read that behavior. Their presence made the household feel more alive, but also more responsible. Evening tidying was not the same as morning preparation. Morning arranged the body for the world. Evening gathered the world back into the household. Things used outside had to be brought inward. Things that might be harmed by night air had to be protected. Food smells had to be managed. Ash, water, cloth, tools, and vessels all required small decisions. The courtyard itself could become a place of softening light. Shadows lengthened. Stone or earth released the heat it had held. A person moving through that space might feel the day leaving through the surfaces around them. The work of tidying, done in that hour, carried a peaceful finality. Nothing dramatic was being made. Things were simply being returned. When the last object found its place, the household could contract inward. The outer space did not vanish, but it became less active. The door, curtain, gate, or threshold regained importance. Night belonged more to listening than to doing. The tidied courtyard stood as a quiet buffer between the room and the wider dark, preparing the sleeping place. Before sleep could arrive, the place of sleep itself often needed attention. Bedding was not an invisible background. Mats, blankets, cushions, woven surfaces, skins, or folded cloth had to be arranged. A person might shake out a cover, smooth a mat, move bedding away from damp, check for insects, or choose the side of a room that felt cooler or safer. Sleep began with preparation. The sleeping place held the memory of many nights. It knew the body's habits. Where shoulders rested, where a blanket slipped, where feet needed warmth, where a child curled close, where an elder required support. To prepare it was to acknowledge vulnerability. During the day, people stood, walked, argued, carried, cooked, bought, washed, and decided. At night, the body became horizontal and trusting. The room had to be made worthy of that trust. Light mattered in this preparation. Too much darkness made arrangement difficult. Too much flame wasted oil or kept the mind alert. A lamp might be placed just long enough to set bedding correctly, then moved or allowed to dim. Shadows helped the room become less demanding. The eye did not need every detail now. It needed only enough shape to feel secure. The final objects near sleep were chosen carefully. A cup of water, a garment for early rising, sandals within reach, a cloth, a small tool, perhaps a charm, perhaps nothing at all except the known wall beside the body. These nearby things created a small island of readiness inside the dark. If one woke suddenly, the world would not be completely unknown. Then came the act of lying down, simple but profound. The day's vertical effort ended. The back, side, or shoulders met the prepared surface. Fabric settled. Breathing changed. The house, which had required so much doing, now asked mostly for stillness. And stillness, after a day of repeated care, could finally be received. The evening lamp ceremony. As daylight receded, one of the most meaningful domestic actions in the ancient world was the lighting of the lamp. Modern switches have made this almost invisible to us, But in an earlier world, evening light had to be prepared. Oil was checked. Wick was trimmed. A flame was transferred or newly kindled. The lamp was placed where it could serve the room without becoming a hazard. A household that failed in these small tasks surrendered quickly to darkness. This is why lamp lighting had an almost ceremonial quality, even when it was utterly practical. Evening did not simply happen. It was answered. The room that had been shaped all day by sunlight now accepted a smaller, warmer circle of visibility. Faces altered in that glow. Pottery shone differently. Cloth absorbed more shadow. Work slowed or changed. The house gathered inward. A lamp was humble technology, but it carried emotional significance. This flame implied continuation. Supper could proceed. A child could be soothed. A note could be read. A threshold shrine could be acknowledged. Bed preparations could begin without haste. Even a tiny lamp restored dignity to enclosed space. Because oil was finite, the ritual contained an element of economy as well. One did not waste light casually. Lamps were moved with purpose, and often fewer were used than would feel comfortable to us. The ancient night, therefore, had gradients of darkness inside it. One bright point served several needs. Around that point, domestic life arranged itself quietly until sleep drew near. When evening approached, the lamp changed the emotional weather of the house. Daylight had been large, impersonal, and shared with the whole world. Lamplight was small, chosen, and intimate. It did not fill every corner equally. It made a circle. Within that circle, faces, hands, bowls, thread, tablets, and cups became visible. Beyond it, the room retreated into suggestion. Preparing the lamp required attention before the flame appeared. Oil had to be present. The wick had to be usable. The lamp had to be placed where it would not be knocked over. A household knew the danger of carelessness. Fire was comfort but also risk. The ceremony of lighting was therefore both beautiful and practical. The flame was welcomed, but it was also supervised. The first moment of ignition has a particular tenderness. A wick catches uncertainly, then steadies. The flame leans, rises, and begins to consume. Shadows move across walls that had spent the day under another kind of light. A familiar room becomes slightly mysterious. This transformation must have happened so often that no one remarked on it, yet it was one of the great daily dramas of domestic life. Because oil was valuable, lamplight taught closeness. People gathered nearer to the useful glow. Work that required sight moved toward it. Conversation gathered around it. A child might be drawn to it and warned away in the same breath. The lamp organized the evening room the way the sun had organized the day. Its smallness made the household more aware of itself. Later, when the flame lowered, everyone could read the night's progress by its behavior. A lamp that burned well reassured. A sputtering lamp announced need. A dimming lamp suggested that speech should soften and tasks should conclude. In this way, the lamp was not only a tool. It was an evening clock made of oil, wick, and flame. The slow preparation of simple food. Long before supper reached the bowl, food passed through many quiet stages. Grain might be measured, rinsed, ground, soaked, or stirred. Vegetables might be trimmed. Herbs might be crushed between fingers or against stone. A piece of bread might be softened with oil or liquid. These preparations were not separate from the meal. They were the hidden beginning of it. Ancient cooking often required the ability to wait while still paying attention. A pot did not explain itself with timers or signals. The cook watched the thickness, listened to the simmer, judged the smell, and learned from the behavior of steam. A little more water, a little more heat, a little more time, these decisions came from memory. Each meal was guided by the meals before it. The tools of food preparation became familiar companions. A grinding stone held the memory of repeated pressure. A knife carried the marks of sharpening. A wooden spoon or stirring stick darkened from use. A bowl knew the curve of the hand that washed it. In modern kitchens, tools are often replaced easily. In older households, a useful object might remain in service so long that it became almost part of the family's rhythm. Food preparation also created smells that announced the progress of the day. The smell of grain warming, onions or herbs releasing their sharpness, oil touching heat, bread reviving near fire, or legumes softening slowly could draw people inward even before the meal was ready. Smell told the household that care was underway. It promised that the day, however difficult, would include nourishment. There was humility in simple food, but not emptiness. A plain dish prepared attentively could carry comfort precisely because it was familiar. The same taste returning after a long day reassured the body. It said that not everything had changed. The street may have been noisy, the market uncertain, the weather harsh, but the household still knew how to make something warm, sufficient, and recognizable. The washing of bowls and the return of surfaces. After food, another ritual began, the return of vessels to usefulness. Bowls, cups, knives, spoons, pots, and trays could not remain as the meal had left them. Residue attracted insects, odors, and disorder. A household that wished to wake calmly had to deal with the remains of eating before sleep fully claimed the room. Washing ancient vessels was a practical art. Water might be limited, so it had to be used wisely. A cloth, sand, ash, plant fiber, or scraping motion might do part of the work before rinsing. Grease behaved differently from grain. Honey clung differently from wine. A pot used over fire required another kind of attention than a cup used only for drinking. The hands learned these differences. The sound of washing could mark the late meal's true ending. A cup set inside a bowl, a splash, a rubbing motion. A pot shifted to drain, water poured away. These sounds were modest, but they told the household that nourishment had become order again. The table or surface was wiped. The crumbs were gathered. The room no longer faced backward toward supper. It faced forward toward night. There is a kind of relief in a cleared surface. A table after a meal can feel like a mind after a task has been completed. It becomes open again. Lamplight falls across it without interruption. A writing tablet may be placed there, or mending, or nothing at all. The surface has been returned to possibility. This ritual also shows how domestic labor often hides inside the word finished. A meal is not finished when people stop eating. It is finished when the vessels are cleaned, the remaining food is protected, the waste is removed, and the tools are ready to serve again. Ancient calm depended on these quiet completions. Without them, morning would inherit the disorder of night. Doors, latches, and the final boundary. As night deepened, doors and latches took on new importance. During the day, an entrance might be crossed many times without much thought. At night, the same entrance became a boundary that had to be confirmed. A bar, latch, rope, curtain, gate, or simple wooden fastening could change the feeling of the whole room once it was set in place. The final closing of a door is a sound of decision. It says that the house is no longer open to ordinary coming and going. The public world may continue outside, but the household has withdrawn from it. In ancient towns, where streets could remain active after dark in small ways, this withdrawal mattered. Safety was never absolute, but a closed threshold helped the body believe in rest. Checking the door also gathered memory. Did everyone return? Were animals secured? Were tools brought in? Was anything left where rain, theft, damp, or wandering feet might harm it? The hand on the latch could become the last practical question of the day. Once answered, the mind had permission to loosen. There may have been small variations in this ritual according to season. In warm weather, a household might want air without exposure. In colder weather, it might seek closure against wind. During rain, the threshold had to resist water and mud. During festivals or visits, doors might remain active longer. Yet the principle stayed the same. Night changed the meaning of openings. When the latch was finally set, the room became more inward. Sounds outside were filtered. Lamplight felt safer. Voices could lower without being lost. The sleeping place became believable. A door is only wood, cloth, or fitted material, but in the imagination of a tired household it becomes much more. It becomes the line that allows sleep to enter. Supper, cups, and the last talk of the day. Evening meals often carried a different feeling from morning ones. They did not always contain more food, but they had the quality of return. The day's errands, labor, weather, and encounters came home with the eaters. Dust settled. Cups were filled. Bread was passed again. Stew, vegetables, fish, legumes, or whatever the household had managed to prepare became not just nourishment but closure. Ancient suppers were built from familiar tools. Bowl, spoon, cup, cloth, jug, lamp. This familiarity matters. Repeated use makes objects almost companionable. A certain cup fits a hand in a certain way. A serving bowl returns to the same place on the same table. These small consistencies soften the end of day. Ritual does not require grandeur. It only requires repetition meaningful enough to be felt. Conversation at such meals may have ranged widely, but just as often it may have touched the small practical matters that keep a home functioning. What must be bought, who is expected tomorrow, whether enough oil remains, whether the cloth has dried, whether weather is changing. Domestic calm depends partly on such ordinary exchanges. Households talk themselves into tomorrow. And yet there is also the quieter side of supper. The last sip, the wiping of the table, the collecting of crumbs, the covering of what remains, the lowering of voices as the room begins to belong more to lamplight than to effort. At that point, the meal shifts from nourishment to atmosphere. The body begins to imagine sleep. Supper gathered what the day had scattered. People returned carrying fatigue, dust, news, irritation, satisfaction, hunger, and sometimes silence. The meal did not erase these things, but it gave them a table to settle around. A bowl placed in the center, a loaf divided, a cup filled and refilled. These actions allowed the day to become speakable. The foods might be simple, but simplicity does not mean absence of care. A stew kept warm, vegetables softened, grain prepared, fish salted or cooked, legumes seasoned, fruit cut, bread dipped into oil. Each required some earlier decision. Evening food often contains the memory of morning labor. Someone had to know what was available, what would last, what needed using before it spoiled, and how to make modest supplies feel sufficient. Cups played a quiet role in this closing ritual. A cup passed from hand to hand or filled individually slowed the room. Drinking creates pauses in speech. It gives people a moment to look down, swallow, think, and begin again. Diluted wine, water, or another simple drink could mark the shift from work to rest. The body, thirsty from the day, received evening in small measured sips. The last talk of the day did not have to be important in a dramatic sense. It might concern repairs, purchases, whether a visitor, a rumor, a child's behavior, an ache in the body, the need for oil, the state of a garment, or the timing of tomorrow's trip. Yet these small conversations are how households steer themselves. Great plans are not the only plans. Survival depends on little agreements made over ordinary food. Afterward, the room changed again. The serving things were cleared. The table or surface was wiped. Remaining food was protected. Voices grew less necessary. The meal's warmth lingered in the body, but its activity ended. Supper had performed its quiet duty. It had brought the day home and made it ready to be released. Folding garments for tomorrow. One of the gentlest rituals of the ancient day may have happened after the meal, when clothing was inspected, aired, folded, or set aside for the morning. Tomorrow's ease depended on tonight's order. A tunic laid neatly, a belt coiled properly, a sandal placed where it could be found in dim light, a veil or shawl hung out of the way. These acts were small gifts sent forward through time. Ancient rooms could not absorb disorder as easily as modern ones cluttered with storage solutions. A misplaced object mattered more when light was poor, space was limited, and mornings began quickly. Therefore, order itself was a form of comfort. The body that rose in the morning to find everything ready entered the day with less friction. There is also an intimacy to handling clothing at day's end. Fabric remembers the body that wore it. A fold at the elbow, warmth lingering at the collar, dust at the hem. To shake it out and fold it is to conclude the day in material form. One returns the garment to readiness and, in doing so, returns oneself to calm. Such scenes rarely enter grand history, yet they are essential. Civilizations were sustained not only by armies and laws but by people who kept tomorrow from becoming unnecessarily difficult. Folding garments belongs to that hidden labor of continuity. Folding is one of the most peaceful forms of preparation because it turns disorder into a promise. A garment lifted from a chair, peg, chest, or sleeping place may first appear shapeless. The hands find its edges. They shake it once. They smooth it. They bring one side to another. Suddenly the cloth has direction again. It is ready not only to be stored, but to be found. Ancient garments were especially close to daily life because they could not be multiplied endlessly. A household might own fewer pieces of clothing than modern imagination expects. This made care more important. Tear could matter. A stain could be noticed. Dampness could become a problem. A belt, pin, veil, cloak, or tunic needed its place because searching in low light wasted precious patience. To prepare clothing at night was also to imagine the next morning's self. The person folding might think, even briefly, of what tomorrow required. Work, market, travel, visitors, worship, weather, or rest. The garment became part of that future. It waited on behalf of the body. When placed near the sleeping area or stored carefully, it reduced the friction of dawn. There is tenderness, too, in handling another person's clothing. Parent folds for a child. A spouse sets aside a garment. A servant arranges fabric for a household member. An elder's cloak is placed where it can be reached. These actions may be practical, but they also say your mourning has been considered. Your comfort has been remembered before you asked for it. The final arrangement of sandals, belt, cloth, and garment made the room less anxious. Night is easier when tomorrow is not entirely loose. A prepared garment is a small anchor thrown forward into the next day. It tells the sleeper that waking will not begin in confusion, but in a world already partly ordered by loving or disciplined hands. The last cup of water and the quieting of the hands. Near the end of the evening, after the larger tasks had been completed, there might still be one final cup of water. It was a small act, but a deeply human one. The body, having eaten, spoken, washed, folded, and settled, asked for one more simple kindness before sleep. A cup was lifted from its place. A jar was tipped carefully. The water moved in the dim light, catching a faint reflection from the lamp. This last drink belonged to a different mood than morning water. Morning water called the body outward. Night water called it inward. It did not prepare the face for other people or the hands for labor. It prepared the throat, the breath, and the quiet center of the body for rest. The sip might be slow. The cup might be held for a moment after drinking, not because there was more to do, but because the hand had not yet surrendered activity entirely. Hands are busy all day in ancient domestic life. They lift, carry, grind, pour, tie, sweep, wash, rub, cut, mend, fold, open, close and steady. By night, the hands themselves seem to need a ritual of ending. They place the cup down. They pull fabric closer. They adjust the edge of bedding. They touch a child's shoulder, a wall, a latch, or the side of a sleeping mat. Their final motions are gentler than their first ones. The cup then returns to stillness. It may remain near the sleeping place for the night, or it may be placed back on a shelf. Either way, it becomes part of the room's small constellation of useful things. In darkness, people feel reassured by the knowledge that certain objects are nearby, even if they cannot see them clearly. A cup of water, a folded garment, a pair of sandals, a lamp almost spent. These are humble stars inside the household night. There is also a soft discipline in not beginning new tasks at this hour. The mind may still remember something undone, but the body knows that the day must close somewhere. Ancient domestic life, like modern life, could always offer another small task. Another corner could be swept. Another cloth could be adjusted. Another vessel could be checked. Yet sleep requires the courage to stop. The final cup helps mark that stopping. So the hands quiet. The breathing deepens. The room no longer asks for planning, only trust. The water jar waits. The cup waits. The household waits with all its small labors paused inside it. And for a little while, nothing more needs to be repaired, carried, measured, opened, or explained. Night sounds and the last look at the sky. Before sleep, there was often one final awareness of the world beyond the room. It might come at a doorway, in a courtyard, beside a shutter, or under an open patch of sky. The air had cooled. Sounds changed character. Daytime voices gave way to softer movement, distant footsteps, an animal in the street, the scrape of a closing door, the muted clink of pottery, or a breeze moving through leaves and cloth. To look upward was not unusual in such a world. Without modern light pollution, sky could be deeply present. One did not need philosophical ambition to feel it. Stars simply accompanied ordinary life. They were seen while hanging linens, while returning from a fountain, while standing in a courtyard with a lamp, while checking whether weather might shift by morning. The heavens were woven into routine perception. This last glance outward may have served no formal purpose at all, and yet it belongs to ritual because human beings repeat what helps them settle. A room becomes more restful after its final check. The door is secure. The lamp is in place. The air is understood. The sky offers perspective large enough to soften the day's small irritations. Sleep, then, is approached not through instant collapse but through a series of diminishing tasks. Ancient people likely knew this sequence well. Noise falls back. Light narrows. The body loosens. The world outside remains, but from a little farther away. Night changed ancient sound more completely than it changes ours. Without the constant mechanical background of modern life, the reduction of daytime activity could make individual noises stand out with extraordinary clarity. A footstep in the lane, a jar set down in a courtyard, a whisper, a hinge, an animal shifting in straw, wind at the edge of a roof. Each could travel through darkness with a soft importance. The last look at the sky may have been practical as often as poetic. A person might check the weather, judge the coolness, look for clouds, or simply breathe outside air before returning to the room. Yet even practical looking can become contemplative when repeated over a lifetime. Stars do not ask to be interpreted in order to be felt. Their presence gives scale to ordinary concerns. A courtyard at night held both enclosure and openness. Walls defined safety, while the sky reminded the household that it was part of something vast. A lamp near the doorway might glow behind the viewer. The air might carry the scent of cooling stone, damp earth, smoke, or distant cooking. These final sensations could gather the day into a single quiet moment before sleep. Security also belonged to this ritual. A door was checked. A latch was tested. Animals, tools, jars, or cloth might be brought inward or placed where they would not be disturbed. The final survey of a household is deeply calming because it transforms anxiety into action. One cannot control all of night, but one can close a door, cover a vessel, move a lamp, and know that enough has been done. Then the eyes adjust to dimness again. The room that waits inside is smaller than the sky but more personal. Its objects are known by outline. The bed or mat is near. The lamp is lower. The sounds outside continue, but they no longer demand participation. The world remains awake in fragments while the household lets go. Before dawn returns. Eventually the lamp burns low, the room cools, and the body gives itself over to rest. What remains in the house is a kind of suspended order. Water waits in its jar. Folded cloth waits on its shelf. Sandals wait by the threshold. A comb lies where it can be found. Bread is covered. The shrine is dim. The courtyard is quiet. The ancient home is full of paused intentions. That, perhaps, is the deepest meaning of daily ritual. It allows life to be interrupted by sleep without dissolving into confusion. Each action places the next within reach. Morning will not begin from nothing. It will begin from prepared objects, remembered paths, and familiar motions. In this sense, ritual is domestic trust made visible. When dawn comes again, the sequence will return. Someone will touch cool water. Someone will smooth hair. Someone will step across a threshold, fill a jar, light a flame, or fold a cloth. None of it will seem historic from inside the moment. Yet these are precisely the acts that made ancient life livable. They made homes dependable. They gave hours a shape gentle enough to endure. In the final stillness before sleep, the ancient home held many unfinished things without being disordered. This is an important distinction. A jar might not be full forever, but it was placed where it belonged. A garment would be worn again, but it was folded. Bread would be eaten tomorrow, but it was covered. A lamp would need oil, but it had served the evening. Domestic order did not mean that nothing remained to do. It meant that what remained to do had been made manageable. Sleep, in this sense, depended on trust. A person trusted that the objects of mourning would be reachable. The pitcher would stand where it usually stood. The comb would not have vanished. The sandals would be near the threshold. The route to water would still be known. The household shrine would still mark the boundary. The little systems of the home would rise again with the body. This trust was built slowly, through repetition. One careful evening did not create it by itself. Hundreds of evenings did. Thousands of small acts accumulated until the house became predictable. Predictability is one of the oldest forms of comfort. It allows the mind to soften because it does not have to invent the world from nothing each morning. And so the ancient day closes not with spectacle, but with readiness. The room darkens. The lamp recedes. A final sound passes outside and is not answered. Breathing settles. The body, washed, fed, tired, warmed, or cooled by the day's rituals, moves towards sleep. Around it, the household keeps its quiet promises. When dawn returns, the same gestures will begin again, but they will not be meaningless because they are repeated. They will be meaningful precisely because they return. The basin, the oil, the comb, the threshold, the loaf, the street, the fountain, the cloth, the lamp, and the folded garment all wait in their turn. Ancient calm was made from such returning things. And tonight, as we leave them waiting, we may borrow a little of that calm for ourselves. So as we leave the ancient room tonight, we do not carry away a dramatic secret. We carry away something quieter and perhaps more useful, the reminder that human beings have long built calm from repeated care. The basin, the comb, the lamp, the loaf, the folded linen, the checked door. Small things, yes, but small things repeated well can hold an entire world together. Thank you for spending this time with me. May your own evening feel orderly, gentle, and unhurried. And may sleep come to you the way lamplight once came to ancient rooms. Softly, steadily, and just enough.